I understand that you've been speaking about co-presidencies quite a lot, and that how these can actually work in practice or in the future in Cyprus. And to start us off, we have two people who have been working on this in practice and in theory for the last 2 years. So Nicos Peristianis and Yücel Vural have been co-presiding at the Cyprus Academic Dialogue for the last 2 years. They've been working together for a very long time, and I'm sure we have all read their work in different guises. I will not take up any more time. I'll just give the floor to them. Nicos will start.
Thank you very much. Naturally, this is the first. I will start with a general introduction on our topic. So the real meat will come from Yücel. But I want us to remember first some basic parameters of what our problem is about. Because the Cyprus problem, no doubt about it, is a difficult problem. We are all very proud about that we are making it difficult for anyone to solve it. One of its features, of course, is that we are talking about a society which is deeply divided for some time now, along the lines of religion, the language, culture, ethnicity, and a lot. Nowadays, we also have different political entities. Just to remind you, as soon as the British came on the island, we had immediately modern politics, a legislative council, and the Turkish Cypriots wanted to be represented as a community, equal participation, and the Greek Cypriots obviously argued for proportional representation because they were the majority. They wanted to have the majority voice. And as you know, the British found this excellent formula of themselves being the arbiters between the two. So 9, 6 plus 3, in the end they had to decide. When the British didn't give heed to the ideas of the Greek Cypriots, they started pressing more and more. They pressed for self-determination, and we all know they were fighting for enosis for a century. When the Republic was established back in 1960, they felt cheated. They felt they were over-generous rights given to the Turkish Cypriots, and they wished to abandon what they considered to be the divisory elements of the constitution. They didn't want separate municipalities, even though they had suggested them. They didn't want many veto rights, and so on. Their ideal has been, ever since, majoritarian democracy, if possible, with minority rights for the Turkish Cypriots. After the system collapsed back in 1963, they turned to enosis once again, even though the constitution said they shouldn't have done that. And when the whole system collapsed in 1974, there was a new demand now for a reunion of the whole island. That became the new aim. And when they accepted a federal solution, they wanted this federal solution to be controlled by a strong central government, so that again, as a majority, they would have the strongest voice, hopefully. The paradox of the Greek Cypriots is that although they always supported the idea of one man, one vote, they always behaved themselves as just another solid community, like a bloc, differentiating themselves very little from the communal thinking and behavior of the Turkish Cypriots. Now, if we come to the Turkish Cypriots, as you know, again, as I said, they saw themselves not as individual Turkish Cypriots, individual citizens, but as a community of equals, founders of the state. Hence, they demanded always equal representation. And when the Greek Cypriots were fighting for self-determination, they wanted double self-determination. They stood for communal separation. When the 1960 consociational regime came, they were happy. because the basic principles that they espoused were in the constitution: segmental autonomy, power sharing, vetoes for the minority, and so on. In 1974, when they agreed to a federation, they always pushed for a confederal model in the sense of having their own state to the extent possible, their own autonomy to the extent possible, and anything else, co-decisions, would be a compromise. Now, may I remind you that in this world that we live today, there are only two systems to discuss, political systems: unitary states and federal states, nothing else. You've got confederations, of course, but it's an agreement between sovereign entities. So it's not an additional system, although one should never exclude the possibility that something new may come up, as I will comment in a minute. You also have something like consociationalism, but a consociationalist state is not a separate state. It's either a unitary or a federal state with some special features of co-decision. So, since the unitary state option, if it was to mean one state in which the Turkish Cypriots are a minority, is rejected by Turkish Cypriots, and since the idea of two unitary states is rejected by the Greek Cypriots, we are left with the idea of federation. Not that federation is an easy solution, but federations, at least one characteristic that we should all appreciate, is that they are called in when the unitary systems fail, when the participants cannot agree to a unitary state, then they may consider a federation because it's a more flexible system. One of the strengths of federation is that they can take care of diversity, whereas unitary states focus on unity, centralization. Federations can easily accommodate diversity. The dilemma with federations is that their very strength is also their weakness. In other words, the fact that their strength is that they can accommodate diversity. Their weakness is that they can consolidate diversity. In other words, things could get worse and even more deeply divided if the system is allowed to go that direction, because they entrench, and worse, they consolidate pre-existing deep divisions. At the same time, we should not be desperate. Of course, there are always improvements to systems, there are always innovations, new ways of doing things. So we cannot say that federations were tried and they failed, or unitary systems were tried and they failed. There are always difficulties in any time that human beings want to associate themselves together politically. And of course, the classical example is the USA. Until the USA, for 2,000 years, from the time of the ancient Greek city-states and their confederations, because the Greeks invented the first type of federation, the so-called confederations, and the Italians. But from that time until the American Revolution and the American Constitution, there were only two types of association. Either you had a city-state, a unitary state, small in size, and a confederation, a coming together of various of these small states, either in hegemonic consolidations or in empires and so on. There was nothing else. And then the Americans, because they disagreed themselves as to what they wanted, some wanted still to maintain this confederal system between the 13 original colonies, but some others were envious of what the unitary states were achieving, Spain, France, the UK, so they wanted to go that direction. And in their conflict, they created what they thought was a more consolidated system of confederation. Only in the end, it turned out to be a completely new system, because the federation, especially as it developed after the Civil War, became a new type of system in which there is divided sovereignty, something which was not conceived conceivable before, in a new way, a new kind of state. So I remind you of this because it was really accidentally invented, and the inventors didn't call it a new thing. They still called it confederation, as you know. It only evolved into a federation later on. And even though they thought in the beginning that this would have been a very decentralized kind of system, it ended up being a very centralized, quite centralized system. In Canada, they wanted to avoid the mistake of the Americans. They wanted to make a stronger federation with a stronger center. They thought they created that, and in the end, as you know, it ended up exactly the opposite. They've got one of the most decentralized systems among federations. Coming back to Cyprus now. We've been talking about the federal system since 1974. There is some distinct progress, of course. We all know of many features that we have agreed about, yet there are still important differences and important concerns. Everybody's worried whether the new system will be viable, it will be functional, and so on. And then there are specific concerns that the communities have separately. For example, the Greek Cypriots are always worrying about Turkey's role in a possible partnership. Many of these concerns are very real, besides, of course, the ones concocted by those wishing to avoid the bitter cup of a compromise solution. Many other worries are really real. These concerns must be addressed. If they're not addressed, we may end up with a solution that is a solution on paper, but people will be afraid to vote for it. Another principle is that we cannot radically change the model being discussed. I think that's a principle that we should all accept. We cannot start talking about new types of a solution after so many decades of discussing a particular system. And as I said, there are not many other alternatives. So to begin to want to change discussion altogether is really not something we can do at this stage. Yet, we can introduce improvements. And our proposal rests on precisely this idea of improving on what the two communities have agreed about up to now. Take what they have agreed and hopefully build on it and try and solve some of the major problems that are creating an impasse at the moment. As already mentioned, it's interesting that President Anastasiadis, just a couple of days ago, proposed this new idea of so-called parliamentary model. So-called parliamentary in the sense that there is a rotating prime minister and there is a president there who the suspicion is he may be more powerful than the prime minister, in which case it's not really a parliamentary system. Nevertheless, my opinion is that we shouldn't belittle new ideas. It's an indication that we still want to find a solution. Okay, it may be sometimes these are just excuses, as I mentioned, but sometimes there are genuine efforts to overcome some problems. And as I said, we think we are trying to overcome some of the problems, but perhaps in a more creative way. And that's why, in any case, when a new idea comes, I think it's wrong for any one of us to dismiss it right away. And I think it was wrong of the Turkish Cypriot leadership to dismiss Anastasiadis' ideas right away, even though they said that they were discussed some time ago. But we don't know about them. Even now, we talk and we only know of 2 or 3 basic ideas. So I think we should demand, the citizens of this country, that when there are proposals, alternative proposals especially, we should see them. We should see the details and we should be able to discuss them. They cannot be just ideas of the politicians. Okay, let me come now to the basic idea before our own proposal. Or in a parenthesis again, just to add that, interestingly enough, Anastasiadis' idea, this bringing back the idea of a president, a vice president, derives, of course, from the 1960 arrangement. But he introduces the idea of a rotating officer, not the president as was agreed, but a prime minister, in an effort to maintain some of the basic elements. And I think that this is good, but it's a wrong kind of solution that was given. We, in fact, don't know many details about the proposal, so we cannot comment about it in depth. Only it reminds you more of the French model than anything else. Okay, what we are suggesting is different, and I'm closing in a minute by saying the following. We are proposing a real semi-presidential system in which there are two powers. The president is voted by the people, and we are maintaining what was agreed up to now. We are maintaining the idea of cross-voting and weighted voting. Okay, so those features are there. They've been agreed. We think they're very important. They unite the people together, and when people together vote for a president and a co-president, if you want, I prefer to think of the two that we vote on a single ticket, not necessarily as a president and a vice president, but a president and a co-president. And they can rotate, but they don't need to have a name that looks inferior to the name of the other officer. So we keep there the main ideas as proposed. What's the solution that we are giving? Decrease the powers of the president. Instead of having an all-powerful president, as in the present negotiations, deciding about anything, we are introducing the idea of a proper parliamentary system and a prime minister who again get voted by the people, and the House of Parliament votes for the prime minister and the ministers, okay? And they do most of the jobs in the House, and they allow the two co-presidents, the president and the co-president, to work on mostly foreign affairs and defense matters. Let me remind you that in all classical confederal systems, always the two functions that they shared together when they united, there were always these two, foreign relations and defense. And you cannot get away with this. So we are leaving these two to the president and the co-president, and everything else goes down to the prime minister and the parliament. We think by introducing a parliamentary system, what we have improves. As you know, there were too many powers given to the president with the 1960 constitution, of course, because the vice president was there. It became much worse when our president was left on his own. But we think that it's much more democratic. All of Europe has a parliamentary system, and some countries are moving to semi-presidentialism as a way of going towards parliamentarism. But it's an easier system to go to from the presidential system. So we go from the presidential to the semi-presidential system. The parliament becomes stronger, and then we see what happens in the future. Nothing is static. Plus, we have introduced a couple of elements that we believe decrease the emphasis on ethnicity. But Yücel will give you those other elements of how, in more detail, this arrangement may work.
Thank you, Nicos. While designing the federal executive in a deeply divided society like Cyprus, we believe that we need to take into consideration particular socio-political facts. Nicos tried to explain that, but I will summarize them. We need to consider first the need for governmental stability. The traditional political culture established in the two communities cannot be changed immediately, so it will take time. So we need to consider them. And we need to develop a model which satisfies both the expectations of the majority and also the expectations of the minority. So, for example, Greek Cypriot side needs to be satisfied that majority is important, but also Turkish Cypriot side needs to be satisfied that their participation in the federal executive is a significant issue. So the model actually aims to develop a new federal executive which is able to address some basic questions. Why do we suggest semi-presidentialism but not a presidential system or a parliamentary system? First of all, as Edward Morgan implied directly and sometimes indirectly, the presidential model is not suitable to societies, divided societies like Cyprus, because it fails to reflect ethno-communal pluralism, ethno-communal pluralistic structure. Because presidential system concentrates executive powers in a single hand, the president. Actually, this characteristic of presidential system has been identified in the negotiation process, and the two sides try to change the system. But they have been very shy, I think, because they didn't see the fact that there are some other effective models. Presidential system, as you know, has been successful, as far as I know, only in the United States, where there is a weak two-party system. Party discipline is weak, and there are two major parties. From this perspective, this system cannot work in Cyprus because there is multi-party system in both communities, and party discipline is extremely strong in both communities. Classic parliamentary system, on the other hand, is not suitable because, as you know, this system is based on a parliamentary majority. And the two sides realized that this system is not suitable, but again, they couldn't make an arrangement to find a more appropriate model. And the model they agreed on it is very strange. In the Annan plan, for example, they tried to mimic a Swiss model, but now they introduced a new element. President will be elected by people through cross and weighted voting. So they moved from Swiss model to a semi-presidential model, but there are some missing arrangements in this system. So Nicos is right when he says that we accepted what they agree, but we added some other mechanisms to identify a semi-presidential model which can work in the case of Cyprus. As you know, in this semi-presidential system, Edward explained it effectively. There are two separate majorities. The president is elected by people and represents the majority, and the cabinet also, another majority, emerges in the parliament but represents a majority again. In our model, we suggested dual executive and a flexible decision-making mechanism. In almost all semi-presidential systems, we find dual executive, but there is a variation. If French model is on one extreme, where the president dominates the executive branch of the state, there are some models where the president, who is elected by people, it is for this reason we call it semi-presidential. The president is more symbolic. There are some semi-presidential system where president is weaker than the prime minister. In our model, actually, I'm going to explain our model through some concepts, so it will be easier for me to explain and for you to understand. You know what dual executive means. There are two executive branches. There are two elected authorities in the executive organ. But we have a different notion here. In our model, it is not like French model where executive competencies are not clearly distributed between the president, popularly elected president, and the prime minister and cabinet. We suggested that in our case, there should be a clear distribution of executive powers. Secondly, the prime minister and the council of ministers will be elected by the lower house through a majority which includes at least 20% of support from the Turkish Cypriot members of the lower house. We also suggest, this is, vote of confidence. In order for a government in parliamentary system, I have to say that the presidential system everywhere is a combination of elements from parliamentary system and elements from presidential system. So sometimes you can find something which is identical to a mechanism in parliamentary system, but you can find another mechanism which is found in presidential system. It is a combination of the two. So vote of confidence by the majority in the parliament is the determinative element of parliamentary systems. We have this mechanism in our semi-presidential model, but we added an additional mechanism. This majority, this vote of confidence, should include at least 25% support from Turkish Cypriot members of the lower house or House of Representatives. In addition, we suggested a constructive vote of confidence. Constructive vote of confidence is found in German system. In order to dismiss the existing government, any majority in the parliament needs to form a new government. This is suggested in order to maintain political stability because there is a fear, both among the Turkish Cypriot political elite and among the Greek Cypriot political elite. This fear is about the governmental stability or the survival of the new system. So this is a mechanism that guarantees the maintenance of the government. But still, if parties want to break up the existing government, they can do it, but we have another mechanism. In that case, the president, which will control only specific executive areas, inclusive of foreign policy, EU affairs, and maybe in coordination with the EU, because Cyprus is an EU member, in coordination with EU, some security issues, this president will have some exceptional executive powers. When a government cannot be formed because of the disagreements between the parties, the president will appoint a presidential cabinet until the parliamentary parties in the lower house find a way to form the cabinet. Actually, in democracies, parties want to rule, want to govern, and almost all parties want to be a part of the government. Therefore, this mechanism will encourage the parties to be constructive, to take into consideration the expectations of possible coalition partners. One mistake has been made in the intercommunal negotiations. They suppose that there will be a coalition between two actors. One is the Greek Cypriot actor, unitary actor, Greek Cypriot community, and the other is the Turkish Cypriot unitary actor. This is not the case. In a democracy, there are many actors, parties, political parties, having representation in the parliament. So here we avoid of imposing any rule about decision-making in the cabinet. Regarding the presidential executive power, we don't need anything because the president is single, and he can make decisions. But in the cabinet, which will be based on a coalition, usually between a larger Greek Cypriot party and a party from the Turkish Cypriot community. We suppose that regional party system will continue. If a statewide party wins the majority of seats in the parliament, why should we tell them how to make decisions? Therefore, coalition protocol, there will be a coalition. Coalition protocol can explain these things. This is another mistake made in the intercommunal talks. Now, the basic issue, which became an instrument of discussion, each side blames each other, saying that, for example, Turkish Cypriot leader blames Anastasiades that Anastasiades does not accept political equality. Mr. Anastasiades blames Turkish Cypriot side that they want to paralyze the state through one positive vote in all executive decisions. We don't need this because we know that there will be a coalition and it's up to them. For example, if two leftist parties form a government, they may decide to make decisions through consensus. They may decide to give some extra powers to the prime minister. Or there is another system, ministerial government. They may decide to give some powers to each minister within the area of within their own issues. So under this system, there is no need to focus on decision-making process in the cabinet. I think I explained what is given as competence to the president. I explained exceptional executive powers. And now I want to explain the advantages of this system. This semi-presidential system reduced or is able to reduce legitimacy gap because the president will be elected with the consent of considerable number of voters from both communities. This cross and weighted voting will eliminate or at least reduce the legitimacy gap. So the president will be the president of the whole people. As you know, in the 1960 Constitution, the president is elected by Greek Cypriot community and the vice president by the Turkish Cypriot community. So the president will never have the chance to be the leader of the whole country. Since we have a prime minister selected by the parliamentary majority, including Turkish Cypriot involvement, this mechanism can satisfy the expectations for respect for one person, one vote principle. This is the basic demand, historical demand of Greek Cypriot community. They said, how can you equalize 75 or 80% with 20%? In this system, we have a mechanism to tell them that here it is your expectation, it is your claim, and we satisfied it. But guaranteed inclusion of Turkish Cypriots in the Council of Ministers satisfy the demand of Turkish Cypriot community to participate in executive organ. There is a participation. As you know, rotational presidency is a point on which the two sides agreed. And the existence of this tends to satisfy Turkish Cypriot demand for political equality. If you think that political equality is significant, Turkish Cypriot should look at the president. they can be president and they can represent the whole country on rotational basis. We know that the existing compromise on rotational presidency includes another principle, longer period of term of office for president from the larger community. This is also an agreed principle. This principle also satisfies the expectations of larger community and diminishes the demand for majoritarian democracy. And finally, we argue that dual executive creates constitutional guarantees against political instability. The president cannot be removed by the parliament. So he or she can stay in power until the end of his or her term. A party with considerable plurality support in the larger community can always be represented in the Council of Ministers. And the existence of exceptional executive powers of the president under specific circumstances maintains political stability when it is needed. It's an exceptional mechanism. Coalition protocol, this needs to be identified somewhere in the Constitution. Coalition protocol encourages cross-communal constructive relations between the political parties. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and now we have James Ker-Lindsay, who, again, we all know from our bookshelf. James is now visiting professor at the LSE, and he's been working on Cyprus for many, many years and has worked on other conflicts as well. So, your insights.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Olga, and thank you obviously to the organisers for putting on such an interesting event. I have to say that I hadn't originally expected to be at the conference. I was trying to plan out my visit, but it was wonderful that I was able to make it here, because this is something that is, I think, you know, we are Cyprus specialists in this room, is incredibly interesting, but something that I don't think there's been a lot of questioning about over the years as to the constitutional structure of a reunited island. It's also, you know, it's been taken as given that it will be some sort of presidential system. And of course, the point that has come out already, and I think it really is worth emphasising, is that the current system that exists here and the system that's been talked about is very much an aberration and an oddity in terms of constitutional systems. This idea of having some sort of presidential structure is one that is very unusual. It's been raised already that there is no other EU member state which has an executive presidency of the form that Cyprus has. This is an American-style presidency. I mean, I'll talk in a minute about how it was set up to be slightly different, of course, but that's essentially where we are. This is not a system that any other country in Europe has replicated, with one very obvious and very recent, Turkey. We know that in the case of Turkey, that when the issue was raised, there was a great deal of concern internationally about the implications of moving to a presidential system in Turkey, precisely because it was seen as over-centralizing powers, and it was obviously being designed because one person had particular ambitions, which really did sort of better serve him having a presidential system along the American lines. So I think, you know, we have to emphasize that in many cases there's a great deal of concern about creating a full executive presidency that exists here in Cyprus. Now, of course, the system that was created here in Cyprus in 1960 was under a very, very different political situation. It was set up in a very different way. And in actual fact, I think there's probably a good argument to be made that what was established here in Cyprus in 1960 wasn't a formal executive presidency of the type that was created in the United States, but might actually be better thought of as some sort of strange hybrid executive co-presidency rather than a single individual vested with this power. Now, of course, we know that the system established had a president who would always be a Greek Cypriot, and we know that Archbishop Makarios was the first to hold that position. But also you had a vice president who in many ways had a number of powers that were equal to that of the president. And it was actually much more of a power-sharing structure that was established. And of course, that was meant to be the check and balance that existed one against the other. But of course, after what happened in 1963 and 1964, as soon as Vice President Kuchuk was no longer able to fulfill that role, what we saw was this emergence of this single executive presidency. So that check and balance that was created in the system was got rid of. Now, I think in many ways it's a testament to the way that the Republic has evolved, that in actual fact, when Cyprus applied to join the European Union, there were no serious questions raised about the political system that existed here. Now, as you're aware, that part of the process of joining the European Union means that you've actually got to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, which means about having a democratic system in place. And to my mind, no one raised any questions about the functioning of the system here in Cyprus in those terms. There was no question asked about the democratic nature. Now, I know Turkish Cypriots would obviously question that, but certainly as looked at from the European Commission when it was preparing its opinion, I've seen no evidence that anyone raised an eyebrow and said, look, we don't think that this is a particularly safe political system. It might put too much power in one person's hands. But nevertheless, looked at as a political system, the presidency here is incredibly powerful and much more powerful, I think, than any other political system that we can find in Europe. The only one that I would say that, would come closest would probably be France. So in many ways, for those of us who are looking at the system and looking at the ways it's been talked about, one of the questions I've often asked myself is why there is this attachment to having a presidential system in any reunited Cyprus. It isn't particularly clear. I just sometimes think that maybe it's a question of familiarity. This is something that people are used to. Certainly Greek Cypriots, obviously Turkish Cypriots, and I'll talk a sec about that, are just used to it. So it's almost as though maybe there's just no questioning that's going on here. And of course, rather interestingly, of course, the two countries with which the Greek Cypriots have the closest affinity, if you like, in political terms or understanding are Greece and the United Kingdom, both of which don't have an executive presidency system. So, I've often wondered, and it would be very interesting to hear from people here, why they think this seems to be so embedded in people's consciousness as to why it has to be some sort of executive presidency. Of course, for the Turkish Cypriots, it's rather different. They have a semi-presidential system, which I think, is very interesting in its own right, how that functions and the problems that emerge with it. I won't go into a lot of detail, but again, it would be interesting to understand how much debate is going on in the Turkish Cypriot community about this. But I think even if we talk, in terms of the Republic, I think it's been very interesting if you look at the history of the presidency since 1960, but especially I think since 1974, to see how that's evolved. And I think, even though the presidency is incredibly powerful, I think we have seen some quite considerable variations from one president to another in terms of how they've wielded that power. And in some points, I think it has actually verged more on a semi-presidential system, and the presidency that I would consider most in this term was that of Glafkos Cleridis, for example, who I think in many ways wasn't desperately interested in the day-to-day mechanics of and functions of running the state. I don't think he was terribly interested in agricultural issues. I don't think he was terribly interested in finance. I think he saw himself very much as focused on the Cyprus problem, and that was very much reflected. And I remember, while I was living here on the island, I was much more aware of a cabinet government. Whether it was a successful cabinet government or not is I'll leave you to decide, but it was much more in that vein. Whereas, of course, with Tassos Papadopoulos, I think this is probably, it would be interesting to hear, I didn't live here during the Kyprianou period, but certainly I think that was probably the apogee of very centralized presidential power in Cyprus, remembering, of course, that he had more experience of government functions than any other political leader, I think, before or since. He'd held more cabinet posts, and I used to live next to a cabinet minister, and I would occasionally bump into him in the lift as he was heading out at 8 o'clock at night, saying, I've just been called by the presidency to discuss some very arcane aspect of whatever policy this person was focusing on. And it was very, very clear, speaking with other people, that this was very much a centralized political system where there was a lot of control coming from the presidential palace. To my mind, I am interested in why there hasn't been more debate about a shift to a parliamentary system. And of course, it is very interesting that just 2 days ago, and it has been mentioned by a number of other people, that President Anastasiades has brought this up. I mean, from what I can gather from what he said, this is not probably along the lines of what most people would imagine by a parliamentary system. I think the idea that you would just simply have a rotating prime minister, and then it would actually be a Greek Cypriot president and a Turkish Cypriot vice president, sort of rather reverses what I think most of us would have imagined from having a parliamentary system. That this actually maintains a very strong logic of ethnic separation. Now, I'm not one of those people who is necessarily against that by any means, but I think that this reverses it in a very strange way. I think most of us who've looked at this have said, well, look, you would effectively have an executive prime minister, and then the role of the president would be much more figurehead. It would be a uniting role that wouldn't have a lot of power, but then could be quite happily shared between the communities as that figurehead role, whereas understanding that obviously 80% of the population are Greek Cypriots, the expectation amongst most Greek Cypriots is that they would have some sort of greater say in executive powers. Now, I know this is obviously very problematic in terms of power sharing and political equality between the communities, but I think there are ways that you can effectively build this into a system where it isn't actually formalized that it's effective Greek Cypriot control, but you can create a system where, by effect, this tends to happen, but isn't cemented as such. Now, one of those ways that you could do this, and I hesitate before I say this, and I think Neo knows where I'm going to go on this, is Northern Ireland, where I think you have a very, very interesting political system that I've often felt that should be looked at more actively in Cyprus, which has been, and this is where I hesitate to mention it, until, what is it now, 2 years? Yeah, all right, so whether one wants to draw on it. But I've always found this to be a very interesting idea, that you have a political system where everyone has the potential to have a seat at the table, and the party that gains the most votes actually gets first take on governmental positions. And of course, the job that they always will want will be the first minister. And then the second party says, right, okay, what are the other jobs that are available? Oh, we rather like finance. Okay, you have finance. And it works through until all the parties are covered that pass a threshold, and then anything left over, you start again. So the major party would then maybe have the prime minister and the minister of agriculture. And I thought that that's always been an incredibly interesting system that probably would mean that the largest Greek Cypriot party would always get the first choice on this. But it would also mean that, hardliners are brought into the system, which I think is a great advantage of this. It gives them the responsibility of not sitting outside of the tent, but being in there. All right, they might not have the best job, but they're still there. They could still get something conceivably that could be fairly significant. And what we've seen in Northern Ireland, most interestingly, of course, was that originally it was the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP, the moderates on the side of the intercommunal divide in Northern Ireland. But of course now it's the DUP, which is the scourge of British policymakers on Brexit, and of course Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the IRA, have become the major actors. And have had to work together with one another. So I think there's a lot in many ways that commends itself. The one problem that I think it has, which I've never been able to square in the Cyprus context, and I think it would be really interesting to get some thoughts on this, is that, in many ways, one of the things that has struck me over the years is that one of the problems we often find in these sort of ethnic conflicts is Politicians are politicians. They do political things. They want to behave like politicians. They like to grandstand. So I've always actually been rather skeptical about the idea of having a terribly centralized political system. I've always favoured as much decentralisation as possible, pushing power out to the communities. This sort of very loose federation used in a very different context from the term I think President Anastasiades has used it in, to basically mean a unitary state where you devolve powers. But I think, essentially this loose system, the trouble, of course, is that if you have a loose system, you've got very few jobs at the centre because you're pushing those down to the communities. And this is the problem that I think we have to grapple with as well when we're looking at the overall political problem and political settlement, is how do you create enough jobs that you can give to everyone to buy them in, but in the central government, but at the same time not have too many jobs that will mean that you will be squabbling over every little issue that could come up. So that's just some thoughts of mine on these questions. I think it's terribly interesting. I was listening to the first two speakers and their ideas, and I just think that it's time that maybe we did have a greater debate about exactly what the political structures will be, and that maybe we've just got into a bit of lazy thinking about the future settlement of Cyprus. Thank you.
Comment?
Okay, I thought that was extremely interesting. The kind of question I have with respect to the proposal for semi-presidentialism in Cyprus is to what extent you've thought about agenda power of the parliament, who's setting the agenda of parliament, because that's the kind of, who is it, the president, is it the prime minister, or the government or the cabinet, because that's a kind of crucial issue in terms of getting legislation passed and setting priorities for the cabinet. And the other thing was around how decisions between the two presidents are made, right? So that's the kind of how vice president, or I mean, not quite, the two figures, right? How they manage their intra-agreement, right? And what sorts of things, possible ways of managing that might be. But I thought that the kind of general framework that you were offering very appealing. In response to James's kind of questions, and this is a kind of general kind of question to think about, I was thinking about was essentially how does the executive interrelate to the bureaucracy in Cyprus, right? I know this is kind of observed comparatively, right? Is that the more parties you have involved in cabinets, the bigger the bureaucracy gets, right? And that can be viewed as a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your point of view, right? To what extent that was posed a problem or an opportunity for government in Cyprus in the future. So just, yeah.
Okay, I think we've got a difference with Yücel on how the presidents may work. I tend to want consensus myself, and he's more liberal than me. He wants whoever is the president at the time to decide. Yeah. I kind of somehow think that we need the consensus because really the issue we mostly quarrel about is the so-called national issues. Yeah, those that have to do with our identity, relations to Turkey or Greece, and so on. And I cannot see how we can get away with not agreeing about these things. Taking any of the two, whoever is the president, to take decisions for himself. Of course, most of these things will not be taken, a decision will not be taken solely by a president. Most probably it will be prepared at the level of the House of Parliament and so on. But even so, I feel that because that's a place where we want the unity of the country to be symbolized, both the duality of it, but also the unity. Those people have to agree as far as I'm concerned. At the House of Parliament, you don't mind if you've got differences because these will be all the other matters of running a country. They are mostly ideological. They will depend on whatever agreements are made before one establishes a government. So there, I'm not sure whether unanimity is at all important. Whoever happens to be the majority decides. After all, as James Ker-Lindsay said, there will be a lot of decentralization to begin with. Many of the decisions will be at the community level. It's a minimal number of decisions that will come at the center. We do have some difference there, but I think it's legitimate. We have to discuss these things time and again in order to reach somewhere.
The same issue. Actually, I'm against imposed consociationalism, forcing the president and vice president, the two persons who will be elected by the whole electorate in Cyprus. The electorate, the voter in our case, will be able to choose one candidate from the south and one candidate from the north. It could be closed list system, so to one pair, the voter can be encouraged or required to choose one pair, one Greek Cypriot, one Turkish Cypriot, in the same pair, or I think the second is better, any two, one from the south and one from the north. So it's up to these two people even to decide about the duration of office of each other. So in the agreed principle, it's, I think, 4-2, for 4 years for the larger community and 2 years for the smaller community, Turkish Cypriot community. I think this is also something which can be debated between the two people if they compete in elections together. Otherwise, this formal principle can be applied. So there will be one president all the time, and vice president will be the waiting one until the end of the period for the first one. The second will be the vice president, just assisting the president. Regarding the first question about the agenda of the parliament, our system will work as if it is a parliamentary system. So both the parliamentarians and the Council of Ministers will be able to initiate proposals or motions. Thank you.
I think, as Nicos had mentioned, it depends as to how much is decentralized, how much is centralized in any particular system. But of course, I was going to say jobs for the boys is obviously very important in a lot of these situations, because that's how you get buy-in. And, I think one of the most interesting talks that I ever heard on Cyprus was the Belgian political scientist Christa Schauer, who spoke. I remember going to a presentation he gave over 20 years ago, in which he said, look, and he went through the Belgian political system for people in Cyprus, and I think they were you could hear jaws hitting the ground as people realised just how phenomenally expensive and overstaffed the bureaucracy was, because this is the way that you make the system work. And I think especially here in Cyprus, where there is still a bit of a tradition that people sort of expect to have good government jobs, it's going to be expensive to make it work. And but again, a lot will depend on how you do. And I come back to this point. I'm just not quite sure how you manage this paradox of wanting to devolve as much as you can to the communities, but at the same time, if you want to make it work, having as many jobs at the centre that give everyone a sense of buy-in would work. So, I'm not come here with nearly as well-formed a proposal as these gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. From the theoretical point of view, you missed out, Professor Peristianis, on one possibility, and that is autonomy, regional or communal autonomy. Some of the ideas that are being branded about speak to me more of thinking like that, but that's just a theory. I have 2 questions, but my basic one is, why go for assigning exclusive competencies to the presidency and not giving them powers of restraining powers, so to speak? allow foreign policy, defense, security to be run by the cabinet, by parliament, and reserve for the presidency the power to restrain, veto, or something like that. Why go for assigning positively exclusive competences? That's my basic question, and that relates to, we're talking about a federation. A lot of the competencies and powers will be reserved for the constituent units. In essence, oversimplifying, we are saying that Parliament will deal with only central finance and economic matters. The rest will be dealt by the parties, or I'm oversimplifying. It's just the fundamental question is, why not go for veto powers? And perhaps we can come back to the question that James Ker-Lindsay posed: why have we been talking about executive presidency style and not something else? And you mentioned the history. You're not quite accurate about the way things functioned in Cyprus with the presidents and so on, Glafkos Skliridis and Dasos Papadopoulos, and that. But that's an aside, and we can talk about that. But in law, at least in theory, Cyprus does not have executive presidency as such. It has cabinet government. Decisions can be taken only by the cabinet. The president and vice president did not have a vote. But of course, in practice, it's a whole different story. A whole different story. But why have we been talking about that in the negotiations? Well, it's history because people are used to that. It's easier to deal with the leaders and so on. But it is also, in my view, the mode of negotiations as well. It is negotiations between the two leaders. Imagine if there was a different type of negotiation. If, say, for example, you had some kind of constituent assembly discussing the solution of the Cyprus problem. It is likely that perhaps a different model, more akin to what two professors have been talking about, might have emerged. Thank you very much.
One of the complications with foreign policy will be its linkage to decentralization. And if you look at the way the European Union operates, there's a huge amount of European legislation which affects what happens at the subnational level in Germany and Switzerland, what have you. And so for one of the trickiest aspects of managing foreign policy in a restructured Cyprus will be how to deal with the EU. And there will be questions of votes on issues in Brussels relating to the decentralized units. I think that's something that bears a fair bit of thinking about how that would be managed. I'm actually quite attracted by the general structure of your proposal. There are a couple of things I really like about it. One is the fact you've got a solution to the issue of blockage with your creation of this executive cabinet during a period of blockage, and I think that creates a good incentive structure. It's possible you could give the president a special role in this area of foreign policy if cabinet is divided, or if there's a major dispute between the regions, the two subnational units and so on. But that's something, I think really needs to be teased through and thought about how that would be managed. And it may be that on many issues, Cyprus in the end just decides it will abstain. That if you're only one vote of 27, and it may be that to manage your internal relations, you abstain on many issues where you can't reach agreement in Brussels, and just take your lumps, as it were. The other comment I would make is the thing I don't particularly like about the D'Hondt method is, it has all the so-called advantages of getting everybody in the tent, but it doesn't permit for the change of government. That every now and then there's a taste for a change of government. So even with the Belgian model, for all its problems, every now and then you do have parties coming into government and parties going out of government. And I think that that's an important dynamic, and it preserves the notion of government versus opposition, which disappears in the D'Hondt model.
Why should we give some important powers to president, and why these powers cannot be kept for the cabinet? If you evaluate semi-presidential system on a continuum, as I said before, French model is on one extreme, where the president dominates. On the other extreme, there is a symbolic president without any real executive power. Any real symbolic powers, figurative powers, are in the hands of an elected president. Here, this the presidential competences in our model are designed to satisfy Turkish Cypriot expectation. That, as you know, there is a historical claim that Turkish Cypriot community is not a minority. But on the other hand, we aim to satisfy Greek Cypriot community because, again, there is a historical claim that majority should be taken into consideration. We gave this in the setup of the cabinet. We understand, we acknowledge that majority is important, is significant. So there is no rotation in the cabinet. The prime ministerial position is not subject to rotation. Here, what is moved to the president includes foreign policy and security issues which cannot be dealt with without considering EU directions. So, as you know, EU is a centralizing entity, and especially on security and foreign policy issues. The member state position and powers are reducing in both areas. So actually the president in our case will be able to represent the federation outside because the president is elected by the whole society, while the prime minister and the cabinet will reflect the will of majority with the participation of smaller community. It is for this reason that some real executive powers shall be given to the president because otherwise you will not be able to convince Turkish Cypriot side because they don't accept a figurehead president to be rotated between the two communities without any rotation in the cabinet, in the prime ministerial position. Just a practical situation because in the beginning we stated that our model considers socio-political facts. These are socio-political facts. And if we ignore this one, we can adopt any system, for example, presidential system, parliamentary system, but this is a reality.
I was going to add that if we move that far, we are really into a presidential system, parliamentary system. If the role of the president is only symbolic, then it can be Greece, let's say. Greece has a president, but his role is only symbolic. And we didn't want to go that far because we started from where we are today. And where we are today is an all-powerful president and the problem of rotation. So we tried to find a compromise that could perhaps be acceptable by both sides.
Yeah, I think there's a number of points. I think, point taken about the cabinet, but essentially what we're talking about is three models here. You've got an executive presidency, you've got a semi-presidential system and a parliamentary, and Cyprus clearly falls into the executive presidency category when we come to this type of typology. But essentially, you're not electing the cabinet. You elect the president who will then appoint the cabinet. You're right, it might be about executive, how it's written in the constitution, but essentially Cyprus falls very clearly into an executive presidency model in that context. So that's why we put it there. But because in the US, the idea is that the cabinet is more sort of meant under the constitution to be an advisory position to the president, whereas here obviously it does have a much more effective decision-making role that's clearly set out. I think your point about Tahont was very, very good indeed. Absolutely. You do have that nature that sometimes you just want to be able to reflect a change in, yes, exactly. the political spirit of the age, and we're moving left or we're right or centrist or whatever. And I think you're right, but we're dealing with a very complex situation here where I know obviously Canada isn't without its particular difficulties in this regard. But I think that can still be reflected very much in a different political system where you can say that, right, okay, at the central role, we need the state to perform a certain function. We need it to perform a function effectively. It needs to be a unifying influence. But obviously, if we're devolving power as much as possible within the communities, there is nothing to stop you having a much more sort of combative, if you like, ideologically based political system that exists within. And we see that very clearly in the United Kingdom, for example, where there is a very, it's often said, and I think with good reason, that Scotland is traditionally much more socialist in outlook than England, which tends to be much more sort of centre-right conservative. And one of the arguments, of course, of, that although it's the Conservative and Unionist Party, why they wouldn't be terribly unhappy to see Scotland go is precisely because they know they would probably get a permanent majority in England. So I think there are ways that you can perhaps actually still have that within a system without getting rid of it, but at the same time having something that provides that stability at the top layer.
The Belgian model actually provides for representativeness in that half the cabinet has to be from each community.
Yeah, I mean, I see Neo's sort of keen to jump in on this one, but the problem is I think we can every one of us in this room agree that this is a hugely complicated problem and why we're here discussing it after so many decades of having these sorts of discussions, because it isn't easy to work out how we're going to get to a system which is going to, square all these different circles and provide a political system, for some of us who come from countries, where it might have been a simpler thing, although I use that very advisedly again in the UK, because I think we're seeing, a lot of tendencies which are forcing it apart and are going to get worse.
There is a distinction between the Honte before the St. Andrews Agreement and the Honte after. Before, it penalized parties from not joining the cabinet because they couldn't get time in the Assembly, Northern Ireland Assembly, and they couldn't get funding unless they were part of the executive. After St. Andrews, you could be part of the opposition. So that became possible after St. Andrews. So the problem with the opposition was partly resolved there. With regards to Belgium, there's a very interesting case of the Brussels capital region that uses something like the Honte. If they cannot form, it's a two-tier system. If they cannot form a coalition government, then each side appoints their own on the basis of proportionality. So that's a form of the Honte, not the same calculation, but the principle of proportionality is included there on automaticity. So the advantage there is that you have the automaticity principle, that parties are automatically entitled inclusion in the cabinet on the basis of their political strength. They might have a disproportionality if you have a minority, as in the case of the Brussels capital region. But the disadvantage is what you see in Northern Ireland, that political parties do not have the need to become attractive coalition partners. So the advantage of your proposal is that political parties need to have a double strategy. They need to stick out. They need to be very attractive to the voters, but they need to be attractive also to other coalition partners, because you can win a lot of votes, but at the end of the day, if you do not have allies, then you're going to be out of government. So they need to follow that strategy. I had this conversation with Errol a few days ago when he was questioning my commitment to and preference to proportional representation, and say the PR system, the way you describe it, is like a Valentine's party for bachelors. You need to stick out, but at the end of the day, you need to have a partner. So it's a system that gives you a lot of incentives. That's why I like a lot your proposal, because it's flexible enough. There's a very clear rule that both communities need to be represented with a certain percentage, but then it allows all kinds of possibilities. You might have an oversized cabinet, you might have a D'Hondt option, you might have a minority government, and that will be part of the protocol. So you don't need to stick on a single rule, which is the D'Hondt or the Belgian system or the Swiss system. The negotiation, the partners in the coalition can decide on the basis of what they would like to do. That said, I still see an attractiveness on D'Hondt for the Cypriot context if we want to see a coalition that involves a Ker-Lindsay. Because we know these parties, unless they're being somehow forced, they're not going to come together. So if the consideration is to get them together, because it's important to have legitimacy and broader participation, at least in the first cabinet of the United Cyprus, maybe the D'Hondt can be used in the first period, and then we can move on to something else. So a lot of possibilities there.
You want to come back?
Yes, indeed. Both reality and conceptual thought speaks a little bit different to what you said. When sometimes certain procedures were suggested, the ones who reacted strongly against having involvement of both communities was the right wing, because they thought that the only ones who can collaborate across the divide are the left wing parties. And so it reminded me very much of what you said about the Tories. And if I may, you never mentioned the Senate, the upper house, in being involved in getting a cabinet approved and so on. And the Senate will have equal representation of the two units. Was that a deliberate act on your part? Because if you were to involve it, then even the minimum votes in the lower house might be done away with. Maybe you have thought of that.
You know, we didn't give any role to Senate in the executive functions. This is why we didn't talk about Senate. Actually, in federal systems, the formation of the executive organ is something done in the House of Representatives. You can create another system, but here the Senate will involve in lawmaking process. It is not ignored, but it will not involve in the formation of executive organ. Just the House of Representatives will have authority in the formation of the cabinet.
Sure, but in some federal systems, especially like the United States, the Senate has a particular role in acting as the main check and balance in approving members of the cabinet, senior officials, ambassadors, and so on. And perhaps that was one of the major handicaps of the 1960 Republic of Cyprus, where the only checks and balances were community-based rather than function body-based. And now we see, since '64, the extent to which the lack of any real check and balances has contributed in the quality of governance and democracy. Thank you.
Yes, the Senate has such roles, but these are not kind of political control of Senate on the executive branch of the state in the United States. I think it's a procedure, as a procedural power, and the Senate checks if the candidates suggested by the president are suitable to such positions regarding the legal consideration. So the Senate may not reject a candidate, a presidential cabinet member, because of his or her political opinions. So yeah.
We'll make sure that half of the ministers are ladies.
Very good question indeed, and I know this has obviously been a huge problem in Cyprus history. I was just talking with somebody the other day that I can't remember, but I think it was only in the 1990s that Cyprus ever had its second woman as a cabinet member. I mean, we knew that Stella Suliotti in the first government that was put together but until then, I think it was Claire Agli, was it, who served as education minister in the early 1990s. So yes, I mean, it's obviously a big issue. But another thing that sort of came out to me, and I'm just wondering about this reluctance to take on board a parliamentary system where you have very much a figurehead as the head of state, as the president, and way that, maybe this idea of having appointment to the Senate, something maybe more interesting is that having some sort of system where, just to throw it out there, the president is elected from the Senate, from amongst their numbers, on the case of some sort of rotational basis. And that separates out the Senate in a rather different way, but also makes it significant and gives it that sort of representation. Because I think there is a lot to be said that, you want to be trying to encourage people from other walks of life to be recognised and to have value here in Cyprus. I think there's just far too much emphasis that's just put on political figures. And I've often liked those countries where, for example, we've seen in Slovakia, the mention that Edward made this morning, they have just elected a human rights lawyer who, a year ago had no political ambitions whatsoever. But this is somebody now who has said, look, I have beliefs, I have views, I want to get those out, has really captured people's imagination, and is now going to be president, somebody who's eminently qualified as a senior lawyer, human rights lawyer, to take on board a position like that. And I think that that's the sort of thing that, really to be encouraging, senior figures, top medical researchers, sort of top, professors, people from all sorts of other walks of life who are making a contribution that in other countries are often thought of as being more suitable for that role and maybe playing some sort of unifying role, where obviously they have a good advisory team around them, but it's much more this arbitration role or this refereeing role, but very light touch. And saying, look, government, you get on with what you need to do. It's not about running foreign policy or anything like that, but just being there to be the symbol of the state, to represent the country abroad, welcome people to Cyprus. I think there's a lot to be said for a system like that.
So when you think about an executive presidency, right, you're thinking about somebody who can put forward a policy, right? To what extent is the kind of problem, or people anticipate problems with the different communities wanting to pursue agendas that will be ignored by the other community, or what extent is it about blocking initiatives that would, would infringe people's existing rights, right? So to what extent is the kind of political problem really around changes to the status quo that could be detrimental, right? Or the ability to pursue policy objectives, right? And I think thinking about that kind of question, right, might tell us a little bit about the way that we think the design should work, right? Particularly, the emphasis on an executive presidency is around the pursuit of active policy agendas, whereas when you think about when you think about forced coalitions, or where you think about a powerful Senate, you're thinking more about blocking things that might be detrimental, right? And so I suppose that's in a sense what I'm asking is, what do people want, what do the different communities want to do, right, with their power, with the power, and what are they most afraid of, as opposed to what they would most like to do? And just thinking about that might give us some answers to these questions a little bit, I think.
Very quickly to the last two comments. Firstly, yes, the semi-presidential system allows even amateurs to join politics for the presidency position. I mean, in a parliamentary system, you cannot have that. Second, though, the last comment is related. The Prime Minister, sorry, the President will have this role of focusing mostly on foreign affairs. In fact, the interesting thing is that in the Turkish Cypriot community, they've already done that. They've got a distinction between Akinci, for example, the president, is dealing mostly with the Cyprus problem, and for all other areas of life in the Turkish Cypriot community, they've got the parliament, the prime minister, and so on. So they've already experimented with it, and the main side which has no other experience than the presidential system is ours, the Greek Cypriot community. But it seems to be working all right on the other side, that somebody's focused on that, and it seems that he can be a little bit detached from two kind of extreme ethnic positions, because he's got a different role to play. And we do see sometimes a great difference between his own positions and the government's position, and yet he survives. So there is some experience next door to us that we can utilize.
Actually, the question is about the legislative functions. Our model focuses on executive functions, but the question is important. What we know is that the two sides have resolved that problem, how the laws can be made. There will be special majorities for specific areas. So as far as I know, that is not a problem, but what is problem is about the organization of the executive organ.
You know, from the UK, this is a really fascinating debate to have, because of course we get no say whatsoever in who our head of state is. It's just, and suddenly I out myself as a Republican. I'm not, but you know, and it just takes me back to a discussion once that they would say, you know, well, maybe we should go to a republic. We should have a head of state, and it was at the moment that people realised that that could result in the President Blair that I think everyone turned against it. But nevertheless, I come back to the point. I think, you know, it's been a fantastic, you know, panel to be involved in, because I think, you know, it's so interesting to start having these discussions and thinking a little bit more about, you know, how this function is going to emerge. Because, you know, I think the point that was made this morning was that, you know, Crans-Montana ostensibly broke up because of security issues, but I think that we understand that actually beneath that there are very strong concerns, especially within the Greek Cypriot community, about how power is going to be shared, and that this is something that isn't really being discussed. And again, you know, people fall back on this idea of we're just going to have some sort of executive presidency, but, you know, there's a great deal of unhappiness about this that just comes out that I don't think is really articulated. People sort of say, we don't like what's been talked about the constitutional system, but they're not really engaging in a real debate. And I think that this really lies at the heart of it. And I think the more of these discussions that can be had between the communities and within the communities, and opening up to new ideas and new possibilities, I think can only be for the best. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for your contributions, and thank you too.